a new father, so I haven't slept in about a week.
Welcome to the club.
But word of warning, if anything. Truly, it's an honor to be with you here on the battlefield, July 1st, 2018, the 155th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Today, we're going to talk about one unit. The program about one unit, one regiment that participates in the Battle of Gettysburg. The 147th New York Volunteer Infantry. 380 men and boys from upstate New York that will emerge onto this battlefield at almost this exact time 155 years ago. And if you look to your east, you can see the men of the 147th slowly but surely emerging from Seminary Ridge into the valley between us and the seminary. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, the men of the 147th New York will go into action north of the railroad cut in support of Captain James Hall's 2nd Maine Battery. They'd see some pretty brutal fighting. They'd be isolated. They'd be outnumbered. They'd be driven back in retreat, suffering enormous casualties along the way. And what we're going to do over the course of the next 2 hours is tell their story, follow in their footsteps, hear from the words of the men themselves that fought here 155 years ago, and hopefully get a better understanding of who these men were, where they came from, what they believed in. Again, this is a small story. It's not a big story. It's an intimate story. Those men emerging onto the battlefield, they mustered in September 22nd, 1862. They mustered out June 7th, 1865. And if you're good at math, you can calculate that out. That equates to 990 days of service in the American Civil War. If you're even smarter, you can calculate out those 990 days into minutes. The men of the 147th participated in roughly 1,425,600 minutes. That's how long the 147th New York was in existence. Today on this program, we're going to talk about 30 of those minutes, or 0.002% of the story of the 147th New York. This is a small picture story, not a big picture story. The men of the 147th New York, though, those that survived the battle and the war, those that returned home in 1865, they counted the 30 minutes they spent at Gettysburg a little bit heavier than the rest of that service. And that's a constant of the human condition. We all count some moments more than others. We all weigh some moments in time, some minutes, more than others. So we remember the birth of our child or our wedding day. We probably don't remember what we had for breakfast 3 weeks ago. We probably don't remember what we were doing freshman year of high school in biology class on March 17th. But for the men of the 147th New York, their 30 minutes at Gettysburg, the morning of July 1st, 1863, those are the minutes they remember and that define them in regards to their service in the American Civil War. Theodore Roosevelt, a Rough Rider, he would write about the time he spent in the Spanish-American War at the Battle of Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill as his quote-unquote crowded hour. That was the moment in time that he really felt alive. And for a lot of those men of the 147th we see forming in the valley below us, that's how they felt about Gettysburg. That's how they thought of Gettysburg in the years following the Civil War. And we see that in the words of the men themselves, writing years later. In 1882, a veteran of the 147th New York, a man by the name of J.B. Pierce, formerly a company officer, he would write a letter to the official government historian of the Battle of Gettysburg, a man I'm sure you're all familiar with, John Batchelder. John Batchelder, he was a landscape painter by trade, but he traveled to Gettysburg in the immediate aftermath of the battle, spent the rest of his life chronicling the story of the Battle of Gettysburg, communicating with officers, soldiers on both sides, including veterans of the 147th. And this soldier, J.B. Pierce, wrote to Batchelder in 1882 this very detailed letter that is forensic in its examination of the Battle of Gettysburg. But at the end, Pierce couldn't help but kind of ruminate on the experience. And he wrote, "You cannot realize the intense interest that I have in everything related to the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a topic of all-absorbing interest, and I never tire of discussing it. The battle is a huge nightmare to me. The command, the forward double quick, the explosion of shells, the rush of artillery, the sharp crack of the skirmisher rifles, the rattle of the volleys, the dead, the wounded, the repulsed, the retreat, a terrible panorama of tremendous events piled up. Today we're going to try to make sense of that tremendous panorama, and to help us do it, we got about 80 to 90 members of the 147th New York that are going to join us on the field today. So give them a hurrah as they emerge onto the field. These men moving forward towards us represent these men represent about 1/4 of the original 147th New York that would have been on this battlefield. Now today, as we follow these men of the 147th New York, we're going to encounter all the normal things, all the normal obstacles we normally encounter on the battlefield. Folks, it's hot out today. This is not a forced march. If you need to drop out, you drop out. We're going to have a water station just beyond the railroad cut for you to utilize. This is not a forced march. Take care of yourselves. We're going to be hiking through brush and bramble. Please stick to the mowed paths. Please stick to the mowed path. Now, wherever we go, we want to make sure that we give a good berth, a good distance between the 147th and us. So don't advance. Stay where you are. Back up. Back up. Otherwise, the folks on TV can't see what's going on. You're going to see more of them than you want to see, I guarantee it. Now, we are fortunate to have with us today, in addition to these living historians, a whole bunch of people who are going to help us out. We have with us historic weapons specialist and ranger extraordinaire somewhere around here, Matt Atkinson, who's going to be keeping us safe over the course of the next 2 hours. Where's Matt Atkinson? There he is. Give Matt a hurrah. Hurrah. Additionally, we have Stan McGee from Harpers Ferry National Historic Park and Steve Bond of the Civil War Defenses of Washington, D.C. Now, the real 147th New York, they fired. And we're going to do the same thing today, except we're going to use blanks. But they're going to keep us safe. We have with us, additionally, Ranger Jared Foose. He's going to help coordinate us and the living historians behind us. And we also have Luke Dixon and Sean Riley. Where are you guys? Give them a holler. Interns extraordinaire. They're going to be bringing up the rear. So when I see them, I'll know everybody's up and everybody's safe. If you have a problem during the hike, go to those two gentlemen or find volunteer John Popel. John, where you at? John Popel in the back. He's your man on the spot. He's going to help us bring up the rear too. Now, when we get across the railroad cut, like I said, the men of the 147th New York, they're going to fire. And we want to make sure we keep a good distance between us and them. So heed the words of the Rangers on the program. We're going to set up a firing line. You're going to be on one side of it. The living historians are going to be on the other side of it. Everybody understand? Yep. Good. Got to happen that way. All right. Anything else? We good? Yeah. All right. Who are these men? Who are the men of the 147th New York? Well, the simple answer to that is they are 380 distinct, unique individuals. They're different people, but they're bound together by certain commonalities, like we're all bound together by certain commonalities. They define themselves, in part, by where they were from. And this is Oswego County, New York. Am I pronouncing Oswego County right? All right. Oswego County, New York. That's 331 miles from us on the banks of Lake Erie. They called themselves the Oswego Regiment, or sometimes they called themselves the Plowboy Regiment. They were farmers, most of them. But like virtually every regiment in the Army of the Potomac, they were lawyers and bankers, shop clerks, mechanics. They were loafers and gamblers. They were men that made their living off the lake. Men like Frank Greer, Horace Jones, Lawrence Cavanaugh. The Lieutenant Colonel, Francis Miller, that would lead the men onto the battlefield on July 1st. Before the war, he was a carpenter. He was a joiner. Other men were students. Other men were immigrants recently arrived looking for work. The 147th New York is an 1862 regiment. Again, they're mustered in September 22nd, 1862. So they're in a different class from a lot of the other regiments that see service in the American Civil War. They're all volunteers. And then this is a point in time where the bounty system really hasn't amped up yet. And they're different from those volunteers that joined in April or May of 1861. They're different. In April or May of 1861, as hundreds of thousands of men in the North and in the South rush off to enlist, there's still a romance to the war. There's an adventure to it. There's a point in time here where expectation has not caught up to reality. There's a romance to the war in 1861. By 1862, the time these men leave their homes, that romance is dead. It's been killed at Bull Run. It's been killed at Shiloh. It's been killed by waterlogged corpses floating down the Potomac River from Ball's Bluff. It's been killed by the prison pens in the North and in the South, places like Castle Thunder, Elmira, Libby Island, or Libby Prison. It's been killed by coffins arriving in virtually every home in the North and South, virtually every community anyways, filled with men who died from malaria, typhoid fever, pyemia. By 1862, the time these men leave their homes, that romance is dead. Winston Churchill once wrote that you cannot gild war. The raw comes through. And so by the time these men enlist, the raw had come through. And so we must assume that the motivations that propelled these men of the 147th to leave their homes, their families, their children, their livelihoods, to join the regiment, they must have been motivated by something else. They must have been motivated by something different. Like I said, they enlist September 22nd, 1862. They muster in. Anybody know what else happens on September 22nd, 1862? A few days after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Doesn't go into effect until January 1, 1863. But when it does, it will fundamentally change the goals of the Union Army. It will fundamentally change the goals of the Union Army. From an army out to suppress a rebellion, to maintain a status quo, to an army out to suppress the rebellion and liberate slaves as they go. Now, what the actual men of the 147th New York felt about that when they mustered in on September 22nd, that's up for debate. That's up for debate. Now, the original colonel of the 147th New York is a free soil Republican, so perhaps no lover of slavery. Oswego County has an anti-slavery society as early as the 1830s, but I suspect when these men enlisted, the vast majority of them, they're enlisting and they're joining the Army to maintain the Union as they then understood it. That's probably what these men were joining the Army for. Of course, we can't know exactly. Like all military units, the 147th New York is a reflection of the society that created it. And a lot of these men are probably subjected to the same racial prejudices that characterize men, women in the North and in the South. Tremendous number of immigrants in the 147th New York. Men from Ireland, men from Germany predominantly. The color bearer, a man by the name of John Hinckliffe, was Swedish. Other men were English. About 20 to 30% of the Union Army is immigrants, and we see that reflected in the composition of the 147th New York. Like most Union regiments, there's a shortage of anybody that has any practical military experience. And that's probably a good thing, because when they get shipped down south, the first place they go are the Civil War defenses of Washington, D.C., where the men of the 147th are digging fortifications. They're going on circuitous patrols. They're generally being bored. Probably characterize their time outside of D.C. That will change. Boredom will transition to abject misery in December of 1862 and January of 1863, when they're transferred to the Army of the Potomac. Men of the 147th, they missed the Battle of Fredericksburg, so their first real campaign, if you will, with the Army of the Potomac is the infamous Mud March. Ambrose Burnside's attempt at a winter campaign. He leads the army out from Falmouth. No sooner does that happen than the weather turns, the roads turn into a quagmire, and the men of the 147th and the rest of the Army of the Potomac grind to a muddy halt. And the morale of the Army of the Potomac after the Mud March hits rock bottom. And that's reflected in the experiences of the men of the 147th. There's a mass resignation of officers in the regiment that happened. And that actually, in some ways, is a good thing, because in March of 1863, a couple things happened that will ultimately forge this unit into what will be an effective fighting force. First is that a number of men from the ranks are promoted to positions of leadership. Two men in particular, Francis Miller, Lieutenant Colonel, 33 years old, that former carpenter, and also a man by the name of George Harney, who will become the major of the regiment. Both of these individuals have previous military experience. That's a good thing. Second thing that happens is the men of the 147th get placed in the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Army Corps. And that's commanded by a, well, he was born in Massachusetts, in Worcester County. His name is Lysander Cutler. He's a brigadier general. He is the original colonel of the 6th Wisconsin of the Iron Brigade fame. He's a no-nonsense guy. He's a strict disciplinarian. He's going to help really instill some discipline and some esprit de corps into the ranks of the 147th. But by the time of the Gettysburg campaign, these men, they've seen very little combat. They don't take part in Fredericksburg. They don't take part in the Battle of Chancellorsville. And so the Gettysburg campaign is going to be their first real test in combat. Now, I assume we're all familiar with the story of the Gettysburg campaign. June 3rd, Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia head north on their invasion. They cross the Potomac River. By the end of June, they're in Pennsylvania. The Union Army of the Potomac will follow them north. And on June 30th, the men of the 147th New York are encamped about 5 miles from here along the banks of Marsh Creek. They spend the evening there. They are to head to Gettysburg the next morning, July 1. Most of the men, they're in good mood. They're looking forward to that short march the next morning, July 1. Most men, right about the morning of July 1st, in relatively pleasant terms. There's no rush. There's no sense of urgency. The men wake up early, but not too early, around 8 o'clock. They cook breakfast. One man, J.D. Pierce, wrote his breakfast was 2 hardtack crackers and a cup of coffee. And that was to be his fighting meal over the next 4 days. They're on the road pretty early. Again, it's a leisurely march. There's no sense of urgency. The men write about the same thing we appreciate today when we drive across the county. It's beautiful, the mountains, the sun, it's pastoral, it's agricultural. The men notice these things. But by the time the men of the 147th reach what would soon be the famous peach orchard, all of a sudden they're ordered to move a little quicker. They look off to the northwest. They see smoke above the tree line. They hear the sound of battle, and now all of a sudden it becomes apparent that these men might go into combat. And at roughly 10 o'clock on the morning of July 1st, 1863, the men of the 147th, just like our living historians would have done, they cross the ridge, they pass the Lutheran Seminary, and they enter the valley in front of us. And what do they see? Well, they see a pastoral landscape, undulating ridges covered with farm fields. They see the McPherson barn behind you all, prominent landmark on the first day's battlefield. They see the woodlot behind you. They don't know what it's called, it's just a woodlot. And they see on top of this pastoral setting a mosaic of chaos and confusion. Shells exploding, cavalrymen rushing to the rear, Union artillery rushing to the front. A deafening roar of battle as what will become the epic Battle of Gettysburg begins. Now, when the 147th emerged in this valley, their Lieutenant Colonel Francis Miller, he has no idea what he's supposed to do. He's not sure where to go. He got cut off from the rest of Cutler's brigade. All he knows is he wants to get his men in some shelter. And so he sees the McPherson barn in between the eastern and western arm of McPherson Ridge. He's going to lead the regiment there, and that is what we're going to do now. Now, the living historians of the 147th, they're going to take the lead. We're going to follow behind them. Our next stop will be the McPherson barn.
I'm not sure I have a red shirt or not, but I'll keep one up. I just think that's hysterical. We need to spread this. Which way should we go?
We're going to let those living historians move into the shade along the trees there for their own safety. But imagine them there. Imagine them there. You're going to be right here? We'll be right here. Yep. Yeah, you got it. You got it. The tail end of our column still crossing the creek there, so we got some time. All right. Folks, welcome back. So what we've done, if you're watching at home, is we've hiked from the eastern arm of McPherson Ridge to the western arm of McPherson Ridge, and now we're in the shadow, well, not really in the shadow, we're near the Edward McPherson barn. Here in 1863 would have been the barn. That's one of the landmarks of the battle. But additionally, there would have been a farmer's lane, a garden fence, a couple of outbuildings, and a two-story house. And when the 147th New York arrives on the battlefield, they cross Seminary Ridge, and their colonel, Francis Miller, he's not entirely sure where he's supposed to go. He ends up getting cut off from the rest of Cutler's Brigade. Hall's 2nd Maine Battery, which would go in position right by the Reynolds equestrian statue behind you, ends up literally racing through the ranks of Cutler's Brigade and right in front of the 147th New York. And so for their colonel, it's like when you're driving a car following somebody and you hit a light and the other car keeps going and you're stuck at the light, and afterwards you're not quite sure where you're going because you can't follow him anymore. That's kind of what happens to the 147th New York. So Miller leads those 380 men over the ridge here to the garden lane of the McPherson farm. Now our living historians, for their own comfort, are taking some shade, but imagine them here with us today. And that's where the 147th New York is, a little after 10 o'clock in the morning, July 1st, 1863. The question that Miller has is, what in the world's going on? What's happening at Gettysburg the morning of July 1st? And again, I'm sure we're all pretty well versed in how the battle begins, how the battle unfolds. Early morning, July 1, 1863, Confederates advance down the Chambersburg Pike from the vicinity of Cashtown, heading towards Gettysburg. This is Heath's division, battalion of artillery as well. They run in to Union cavalry, roughly 2,000, led by General John Buford. Confederates are trying to move towards Gettysburg. Buford's cavalry are trying to stop them, trying to slow them down, trying to delay them, using the undulating ridges west of Gettysburg to delay the Confederate advance, to buy time with space and lives. And what Buford hopes he can do is hold off long enough till the 1st Army Corps, 10,000 men strong, and their commander, Major General John Fulton Reynolds, can arrive on the scene. And then Reynolds can decide what to do. The question Buford has is, can he hold? And if so, what happens next? But John Fulton Reynolds, he's one of the great figures of the Battle of Gettysburg. He's a Pennsylvanian. He's a West Pointer's professional soldier, respected by virtually everyone in the Army of the Potomac, which is a tough thing to do. He is a good friend with George Meade, commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, and Meade has given Reynolds an enormous amount of latitude to make decisions, to act decisively if he needs to. Now, Reynolds woke up at Moritz Tavern, south of Gettysburg, about 5 miles away, on the morning of July 1st, 1863, and I think Reynolds probably didn't expect to have a battle on July 1. Don't think he expected to have a battle. I also don't think John Reynolds expected July 1 would be the last day he'd be alive. And it's not until he rides ahead of his command and reaches Gettysburg and confers with John Buford on this ridge, most likely, that Reynolds grasps the totality of the situation happening west of Gettysburg. Confederates are moving down the Chambersburg Pike. Confederate infantry. They've engaged Buford's cavalry. Buford informs him that his scouts are telling him that the entire Army of Northern Virginia appears to be moving in this direction. And certainly Reynolds would appreciate the significance of the road network of Gettysburg. He likewise probably would have recognized the imposing terrain south of town. And John Reynolds has a decision to make. What does he do? How does he react to this? How does he respond to this? And I think so often when we study history, we start at the end. We start at what happens and then work our way back and try to gain an understanding that way, as if everything is inevitable and everything's written in stone. And nothing's written in stone for John Reynolds. There's a whole bunch of things he can do the morning of July 1. He doesn't have to fight at Gettysburg. He could fall back all the way to Taneytown, to Emmitsburg, the rest of the Union Army. He could do that. He could fall back to Cemetery Hill, tell the First Corps to go there. That would be the conservative thing to do. But Reynolds is an aggressive guy, and he acts aggressively. He's essentially going to decide to do the same thing that John Buford was doing. Hold the ridges west and north of Gettysburg. Buy time with lives, hold back the Confederates until George Meade and the rest of the Army of the Potomac can arrive. That, I believe, is his plan. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what he intended, because he ends up getting killed about 30 minutes later. But the last dispatch he writes to Meade, he says, I'm going to hold him back as long as I can. If I'm driven in the streets, I'm going to barricade him, and I'm going to hold him off as long as I can. I'm going to paraphrase Napoleon Bonaparte, and I'm going to misquote him terribly. But Napoleon once alluded to the idea that audacity, for audacity's sake on a battlefield, can be a kind of weapon. It can throw the enemy off balance. It can stun them. And I think that's what Reynolds is going to attempt to do here on this ridge the morning of July 1. He's going to take over for John Buford's cavalrymen. He's going to rush his 10,000 men of the First Corps forward. That's when the men of the 147th are going to pick up the pace. That's when they're going to cut across field past the Cadore farm in what would a few days be the site of Pickett's charge. He's going to rush the men along. And when the 1st Union Infantry and the 1st Union Artillery arrive on the battlefield, they're going to be Cutler's Brigade and the 2nd Maine Battery. Reynolds will turn to Captain Hall and his 2nd Maine Battery first. He has the men, again, rush through Cutler's line to get here, and Reynolds will place Hall, again, about where the Reynolds equestrian statue is today. James Hall has 6 guns. They're 3-inch ordnance rifles, and Hall has 2 objectives. Engage the Confederate artillery, about 12 guns, on Hers Ridge, counter battery fire, and cover the rest of the Union infantry as they arrive on the field. Now, I'm not an artilleryman, but I think if we could resurrect Captain Hall and bring him back to life, he would say that's one heck of an exposed position. It's advanced, it's much more open in 1863 than it is today, and it's a dangerous spot for Hall to be. But Reynolds is going to be sure that Hall has infantry support, and he's going to pull from Lysander Cutler's brigade to do that. So 2 of Cutler's regiments, the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York, they're going to go on top of the ridge behind you, McPherson's Ridge, the western arm, from the left flank of Hall's battery south to roughly the edge of the wood line. That's their sector of the battlefield. The other 3 regiments that Cutler has with him, the 76th New York, the 56th Pennsylvania, and the 147th New York, in that order, will extend the battle line on Hall's right flank to the north. That's the plan, that's the idea. Reynolds himself is going to see to the left. Everything south of the Chambersburg Pike and the railroad cut. Reynolds is going to be the man on the spot. Everything north of the Chambersburg Pike and the railroad cut is going to be under the direction of Lysander Cutler, the brigade commander, and James Wadsworth, division commander, New Yorker, former politician. That's how all of this is going to be unfolding. Now, nothing works as planned, though, right? Nothing works as planned. 14th Brooklyn, 95th New York, they take the ridge. Hall moves in position. Almost immediately, he's engaging the Confederates. There are skirmishers, Mississippians, right in front of his position early on. The 76th New York and the 56th Pennsylvania, those other 2 regiments of Cutler's brigade, they're going to cross the Chambersburg Pike beyond where you see the railroad cut bridge today. They're going to turn left. They're going to try to move on line with Hall's battery, but almost immediately they run into Mississippians and North Carolinians. In this case, the 2nd Mississippi and the 55th North Carolina. Now, the 147th, like I said, they have no idea where to go because they got cut off by Hall's battery. Miller loses the rest of the column. He's not sure what he's supposed to do. He wants to get his men out of the line of fire, so he brings them here. So we're the 147th New York. And then Miller will ride off, try to figure out what the heck in the world's going on. And we know they stopped here because a lot of the men wrote about it, because they went into the basement of the barn, either for shade, like we probably want to do today, or to get out of the line of fire. They're only here about 5 minutes. They're only here about 5 minutes before Miller returns with a new understanding of what he's supposed to do. So Miller and the 147th, they're not going to backtrack and follow the rest of Cutler's brigade. They're just going to go straight across the field behind Holmes Battery. They're going to cross the railroad cut at a dip, move into the fields, turn left, and occupy their position. That is Miller's intent. Does everybody understand that? All right, let's talk about the battlefield a little bit. I've already mentioned a couple of features. We have the undulating terrain, Seminary Ridge, McPherson Ridge's eastern arm, McPherson Ridge's western arm. We have the Chambersburg Pike, and beyond that, the railroad cut. The cut's here in 1863. There's no track laid yet. The landscape, as a general rule, is much more open in 1863 than it is today, as a general rule. We've done a lot of work over the past 20 years to rehabilitate parts of the battlefield, but we haven't really done it everywhere. So if we're a soldier in the 147th, and we arrive here on July 1st, 1863, we see the undulating ridges. We see what will be called Reynolds Woods, Herbst Woods. To our west, most of that vegetation that you see is not there. It's much, much, much more open as a general rule. We'd be able to see Her Ridge really well. It's just about a mile to our front. And that's where Confederate artillery is going to be positioned. The landscape is, again, as a general rule, more open in 1863 than it is today. And it has to do with a lot of things, farming practices being one of them. Now, one of the things that we do as a battlefield park to keep the landscape agricultural, to keep it pastoral, we lease out a lot of the land to farmers. We're in an ag field right now. That's why I'm always asking you to be respectful of the crops in here. Again, they know we're going to be out here, but that keeps the battlefield looking agricultural, keeps the battlefield looking pastoral, and it gives off that 1863 vibe. Now, in 1863, as the men of the 147th are filing into the battlefield, what they're encountering is a wheat field, and it's a very prominent wheat field. Most of the men wrote about how the wheat was about waist high, and with the exception of the railroad cut, no other factor on the battlefield, terrain factor anyways, is going to affect their experience as much as the wheat, because it provides cover and concealment for whoever's in it. Got a little artillery going on. Good. It provides cover and concealment. One of the challenging things of piecing together the story of the 147th New York is that they wrote no official report. No official report. So we can depend on Hall's report. We can depend on Wadsworth and Cutler. They write an official report. But from the 147th, there's nothing. And they don't have a really well-developed regimental history, to be completely honest. And so a lot of what you can pull from are certainly letters, newspaper accounts at the time. You can draw from those. The National Tribune, it's a Union Veterans newspaper. They wrote a lot in the pages of the National Tribune about what they experienced at Gettysburg. But remember, when they emerge on the battlefield, we're on the battlefield almost 4 times as long as they were, at least in this position. They're only out here about 30 minutes. And they had no idea what individual terrain features were called. And so in their letters, they talk about the first ridge, the second ridge, the third ridge, or the middle ridge. And it can make piecing together what they did kind of difficult. But we're fairly confident that the men of the 147th, they left in McPherson Barn, they crossed the cut, they filed into the field in front of us, and they faced west towards the enemy. What enemy will the 147th encounter? Davis's brigade of Mississippians and North Carolinians. Couple things you need to know about his commander, Joe Davis. He is the nephew of President Jefferson Davis, and he's not a terribly good soldier. Not a terribly good soldier. As a matter of fact, the Confederate Senate stalled his appointment to Brigadier General, in part because it is what it is. It was nepotism. But eventually he becomes a Brigadier General. And on the battlefield in front of us, he has 3 regiments on the field in front of us. The 42nd Mississippi, they'd be to our left. To our center, the 2nd Mississippi. And on the far, far right, tangling with Cutler's right flank, is the 55th North Carolina. So you got 3 regiments versus 3 regiments. 42nd, 2nd Mississippi, 55th North Carolina versus the 147th New York, 56th PA, and 76th New York. But Davis has a lot more men. He has close to 1,700. Cutler, on this side of the cut, has about 1,000. So they're outnumbered. Now, the only way the men of the 147th are going to be able to provide support for Holmes Battery is to advance to that distant ridge. And the 147th, that's what they're going to do now. So they're going to advance. We're going to follow them. They're going to go all the way to the top of the ridge. We're going to stay just below that ridge. Everybody make sense? Yes. Now, as the men of the 147th advance, they're moving through that wheat field. The enemy is clearly in front of them, but they have no idea where. So imagine as we move, you're walking through that wheat field. The enemy is somewhere in front of you. All right, let's go. Let's let the 147th move first. Stay behind me. Stay behind me, please. Hold here. Hold here. Hold here. Now the real 147th, they would have been loading as they moved across the fields by the Kadori farm. Obviously for safety, we're not doing that today. Remember, this is about 1/3 to 1/4 of what the original 147th New York would have been. Their left flank rests on the cut. Their right flank actually hits a rail fence that would have bisected the field here in 1863. They send out no skirmishers. No skirmishers in front of their line. So the first contact they're going to make is with the main battle line. Give them a moment. All right, at a slow advance, let's move. Keep it slow. Not always, but they got to be able to, the training has to be able to provide support somehow. So it varies situation by situation. If you look what the 147th is doing, they're right on line with Paul's case-off. Keep it slow, folks. Keep it slow. No one. There on the right. Whoa, get that guy. John, watch your right flank over there. All right, hold.
Well, you weren't kidding.
Behind the yellow line. BCN?
Take the orange. Take the orange.
Let me stop right about there. Jared, halt him. All right. Almost immediately the men take fire and they return fire. Remember, they're advancing into a wheat field. It's waist high. In their front, Confederate skirmishers from the 42nd and 2nd Mississippi. Now the wheat is so tall that most Union and Confederate soldiers, at least in this sector of the battlefield, they really can't even see one another till they're right on top of one another. But 147 to move forward, they take casualties almost immediately. 2 men hit directly. Hiram Stowell and a man by the name of Celestine Berkeley. A minute later, a man by the name of Frederick Riff is hit. He falls on Stowell's body. Casualties are mounting even in the first moments of the experiences of the 147th New York. Now, off to the left of the 147th is Holmes Battery. They're under fire as well. Now, Hall can barely see the 147th because of the smoke, because of the wheat. It is incredibly confusing. It is incredibly chaotic. And things will quickly deteriorate for Cutler's brigade, particularly for the 147th. Remember, Cutler's outnumbered. He's got about 1,000 men. Davis in his front, about 1,700. And the fact of the matter is that Davis's left flank overlaps Cutler's right flank. So before long, there would have been two regiments behind you, the 76th New York and the 56th Pennsylvania. They're having a tough time keeping Confederates in their sector at bay. Meanwhile, the 147th New York, they're isolated. There are about as many people to their right today as there were in 1863. They're exposed. There's not any help coming up to support them. Now back on the ridge, James Wadsworth, their division commander, he sees what's unfolding. He knows that Cutler's men, they can't hold. So after 10 minutes, 15 minutes max, he sends out an order for the 76th New York, the 56th Pennsylvania, and the 147th New York to fall back. And they do. 76th New York, they fall back. 56th Pennsylvania, they fall back. And remember, those two units are back there. Now a messenger rides out here, finds the colonel of the 147th, Francis Miller, who's apparently still mounted, still on his horse. The messenger gives Miller the order to withdraw. No sooner does Miller grab it, receive it, and the messenger run away, then Miller's hit. He's shot in the head, either in the head or the throat, the accounts vary. It stuns him. His horse, by a couple of accounts, actually takes off. And now Miller's out of the picture. And he never relayed the order to the major or to the rest of the regiment to pull back. And now Major George Harney, the major, is in command of the regiment. He has no idea what's going on. He turns and he sees the 76th and 56th leaving the field. But he doesn't have any order to do that. He turns to his left and he sees Holmes Battery increasingly being pressured. He doesn't know what to do. And now, when those other two regiments, when they fall back, every other Confederate regiment on the field, they now turn their attention on the beleaguered men of the 147th. So what they do is the 147th refuse their right flank to encounter this new threat, the 56th North Carolina, moving towards them from this direction. But it becomes very apparent very quickly that the men of the 147th, they're not going to be able to hold on for very long. So George Harney, the major, he brings together all the officers near him. They hunker down behind the ridge, probably about where we are right now, and they talk about what to do. Should they hold? Should they retreat? If they retreat, they're leaving Holmes Battery in one heck of a predicament. What should they do? Now, most of the men of the 147th New York talked about how they knew enough about Southern prisons that they did not want to go there. That's not a place they wanted to go. So they determined they're going to hold off as long as they possibly can. They're going to try to keep their position as long as they possibly can. But before long, the pressure is so great that it's going to be a very tricky situation extricating themselves. Now, meanwhile, back on the ridge, James Wadsworth turns his attention to the 147th and is wondering, what in the world are they still doing out there? How come they haven't fallen back? He'll dispatch one of his aides, a man by the name of T.E. Ellsworth. And imagine you're Ellsworth, and you got to rush out to the 147th and tell them to get out of Dodge. It's like running a gauntlet, and that's basically how Ellsworth describes it. He rushes out here, finds George Harney, tells him, you got to get back. And Harney will then take it upon himself to lead his men from the field. And he has a great quote that is not entirely military, but I think it reflects the situation that the men of the 147th encountered. Let me see if I can find it for you. It's back here somewhere. But he basically tells the men to, in retreat, double quick, run. And that's the command to get out of Dodge. All right. We can see the situation of the 147th deteriorating in our front. What we're going to do is fall back, just like the 147th had to do, and we're going to head just a short ways to where those people are right there. All right, so I'll meet you back. We want to give our living historians some distance. All right. Men of the 147th New York, we're out on that third ridge, maybe 15, maybe 20 minutes. Wasn't a terribly long fight. Their retreat was chaotic and confusing. One soldier recalled, each one who still had a good pair of legs put them to practical use. I, for one, never used mine to better advantage than I did for nearly half a mile at this time. Now, because of the way the Confederates are advancing on them, most men actually retreat right into the cut. And they get in there and they figure out, hey, maybe that wasn't the best idea. Because where they enter the cut, it quickly becomes incredibly steep, almost impassable. And men write a lot about having to basically climb up the side of the cut to get out. J.V. Pierce, one of the soldiers I've been quoting from, talked about how he's trying to use brush and roots to get himself up. Meanwhile, bullets are kicking up dirt all around him. He made it out of the cut, but men remembered different things about the retreat. They remembered different things. One soldier remembered the Confederates were pursuing so hotly, and they were firing so rapidly that a lot of them were forgetting to take their ramrods out. And the man noted that the sound of a ramrod whistling through the air produces a sound that is so demoralizing, if you didn't hear it, you can't quite understand it. Another soldier recounted the Confederates were so close to his rear that someone threw a camp hatchet at him. A lot of men remembered the death of the color bearer, a man by the name of John Hinckliffe, 6'2", Swedish. As he's bringing the flag back, he's shot multiple times. He falls, and as he falls, his body wraps in the folds of the flag, soaking it with his blood. A lot of men remembered that. A lot of individuals remembered a man by the name of William Wyburn, who saw the colors fall, races back out, rolls the body of Hinckliffe off the flag, tears the flag from its staff, bunches it up, and gets out of the battlefield with it. As he's moving, he's actually hit. He's knocked to the ground. Everyone who saw him thought he was dead, but Wyburn raises himself up, and brings the colors off the field. A lot of men remembered that. A soldier by the name of J.V. Pierce, who I've talked about quite a bit, he remembered finding his friend Edwin Aylesworth. Pierce wrote, I found him mortally wounded. He begged me not to leave him. I stopped, and with Peter Schutz assisted him to his feet and tried to carry him. Peter took him on one side, I on the other, but his thigh was broken and he could not walk, and we could not carry him and escape. And so we laid him down with the rest. His piteous appeal, don't leave me, boys, has rung in my memory these 5 and 20 years. Do you remember that? Virtually all of the men remembered the arrival of the 6th Wisconsin, 14th Brooklyn, and 95th New York, who essentially came to their rescue. Those 3 regiments, well, the 14th Brooklyn and the 95th New York, they leave their position on the southern side of the road, rush here to the lip of the cut, and fire at Davis's Confederates in the cut itself. The 6th Wisconsin, led by the indomitable Rufus Dawes, does the exact same thing. And what that does is it halts Davis's advance against the 147th, and it gives the men of the 147th some time to get out. They brought 380 men into the field that day. And in roughly 30 minutes of time, they lost as many as 207. 207. In roughly the same amount of time we were out on that ridge, maybe just slightly more. 207 men. And that wasn't the end of the story for the 147th New York. They'd fight again later that day, July 1. They'd fight again at Culp's Hill, July 2nd. They'd fight again on July 3rd on Culp's Hill. They're one of the few regiments that fight all 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg. Of the 380 men that entered the battlefield, by the time they leave, about 300 men have been killed, wounded, missing, captured. And the men of the 147th, like I said, they spent 990 days in service. 1,425,600 minutes. But those that survived, they remembered these 20 to 30 minutes here on the Gettysburg battlefield more than all those other minutes combined. The men of the 147th would suffer 40% of their battle casualties for the entire war on that ridge on July 1. 40%. And so even though it's only 0.002% of their service, I think it's an important story, and it's an often overlooked story. And I'm so grateful to these living historians who've gone through one heck of a march to be with us today and to help us bring that to life. We owe them a substantial debt of gratitude. Now I'm going to conclude today, because I know we're all hot, we're all sweaty, with one final quote. And it's the same quote that I started off with. and it really has to do again with the impact of the battle. When the folks of Oswego County, which I've been told was on Lake Ontario, not Lake Erie, when they pulled out their morning newspapers 2 weeks after the battle, they saw this, which is a close to being finalized list of the casualties. And so I don't think the people of Oswego County took any consolation in the fact the men of the 147th helped save Holmes Battery, that they fought tenaciously, that they played a pivotal role in one of the great battles of American history. But the men who fought here, they did feel that way. And they never forgot the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'll close with this from J.B. Pierce, writing again to John Batchelder in 1882. You cannot realize the intense interest that I have in everything related to the Battle of Gettysburg. It is a topic of all-absorbing interest, and I never tire of discussing it. The battle is a huge nightmare to me. The command, the forward double quick, the explosion of shell, the rush of artillery, the sharp crack of the skirmisher rifles, the rattle of the volleys, the dead and the wounded, the repulse and retreat, a terrible panorama of tremendous events piled up, events that make and unmake nations, bring desolation and anarchy, peace and prosperity. And with that, I thank you for slogging it through with me. Have a safe day. Have a cool day. Show your appreciation to our living historians. We hope to see you on the field later in the day as well. Take care of yourself. Thank you all.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Isn't there a big controversy about where the location of the monument is?
Yeah, Batchelder put them online with the other units.
Yeah.
None of them.
They didn't like
They wanted it out there.
They wanted it out there.
They wanted it out there. Yeah.